Maybe yes. Well, Michael Kelly is the Deputy Managing Director of the WLPGA. He heads a program, a very important program within the WLPGA, which is looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how we can link the growth of the LPG industry and hang them on a hook, such as the UN SDGs. So with that, Michael, over to you. I'll jump off.
Okay, well, thank you, David, and hello to everyone. It's great to be here. I was just actually chatting with Manjuku and congratulating her on putting this together. Another great event. I wish I was joining you in magical Kenya. It is a country that I like a lot, and Manjuku knows that. But I do hope to get back soon when all this is over and be able to spend time with you and see the transformation that has taken place in the Kenyan market over the last few years. I think the first time I went to Kenya, the first time I met Wanjuku was like 2006. And it's been amazing to see that transformation, how the market's grown, and the potential that it has. And it's been wonderful to be a part of that as well. So I look forward to joining you guys in Kenya. And as I always tell Wanjuku, I'm running short on coffee, Wanjuku. So I can't wait to come and see you guys to stock up. Today I'm going to be talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a series of 17 goals which were set out by the United Nations. Hopefully to be achieved by 2030. They cover a myriad of different areas. But first, Alfred, if you give me the next slide, I'll walk you through my presentation. And I always begin with images to kind of set the scene and give a visual of what we're actually talking about. And I know that most of you do have a very close understanding of what energy poverty is like for millions of people around the world. Next slide, please. What that actually does to our homes or to people's homes in developing countries, and what it's like to be in a smoky home, and you can imagine what it's like to experience that on a daily basis, 2 or 3 times a day. Next slide, please. And then, of course, what happens in urban areas. And one of the lessons we've learned from the COVID crisis is how the air had cleared in a lot of the megacities in developing countries. And this photograph was taken in Kenya in February of in Delhi in February of 2017. And it was interesting to speak to my friends in India during confinement about how they, for the first time in years, they could see the mountains behind Delhi and they could see blue skies. That was one of the side effects of the lockdowns, and one that's unfortunately gone away. But it did make people understand the benefits of clean air, not only in homes, but also in our urban areas. Next slide, please. And of course, all of these things have been made more difficult and more complicated by the coronavirus, which has just made things incredibly worse for so many people. Although, as we heard from James in the earlier presentation, our industry has managed to weather this storm fairly well, which is, I think, a testament to the flexibility, the adaptability of the LPG industry. One of the things that happened at the beginning of this crisis was in the shelter-at-home and lockdown orders around the world, we noticed a trend that pretty much every government on the planet recognized the LPG industry as necessary, as essential, and all over the world, our industry was given special dispensations to continue its operations. And the industry managed to adopt its operations so that it was able to protect its customers and also to protect its workers. So I think we, as an industry, have a lot to be proud of. When the rubber met the road in the teeth of a global crisis, our industry managed to keep going, and as James pointed out, our industry even managed to maintain and in some cases grow. Next slide, please. So turning back to the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the reasons I'm speaking to you about this is as part of the role of the World LPG Association, the global voice of the LPG industry, is to represent the industry as an interlocutor with this whole constellation that exists of international development organizations and NGOs, academic bodies, United Nations departments, development banks. A lot of them you see here. WLPGA is the organization that is the front face of the industry for this myriad of different organizations. And the uber example of of the kind of work that we do, the next slide please, Alfred, is in the climate change process. There will be a big negotiation which will take place the 1st to the 12th of November in Glasgow. They hope. The UK government is saying that it will take place as a real live person-to-person event. But these COPs, as they're called, conferences of the parties, happen at the end of every year. You might remember a big one which took place here in Paris in 2015, from which the Paris Accords emerged. A big one which happened a few years before that in 2009 in Copenhagen was also kind of a landmark, catastrophic COP. The United Kingdom government has indicated that it wants to make COP26 in Glasgow this year extremely important. It has a very ambitious agenda that it wants to achieve in terms of getting the whole planet to sign on to reductions of CO2 emissions. And the job of WLPGA in this context is to represent the interests of the industry and then communicate back to the industry what the implications are. And we would do that at a global level, and then we would do that through our national associations like the PIEA, and they can communicate that information down through their various members to a very granular level. Next slide, please. So, the Sustainable Development Goals I mentioned, there's 7. They are, yeah, there we are. Okay, so they're known as the Global Goals, and they were adopted in 2015 at the end of what were called the Millennium Development Goals, which started in 2000 and went to 2015. These started in 2015 and are meant to be achieved by 2030, and the entirety of the global development system is signed on to these things. It's being driven through the United Nations, and a lot of the funding is coming through the World Bank and the various other different development agencies. So they're very ambitious goals, and it's interesting to speculate what the role of LPG is in this context. Next slide, please. So here I list them all. They have these great images, and you can see, looking all the way from 1 to 17, some of them are quite obvious, which impact the LPG industry, and I'm probably focus on SDG 7, providing affordable and clean energy is kind of the centerpiece of where our industry will be, the work that we do. But there's a lot of other SDGs where the LPG industry has an impact or plays a role. And Alfred, if you show me the next slide, we put the 7 most impacted by the LPG industry, so where we contribute the most as an industry up here. So gender equality, I was happy to hear about the launch of UN LPG today in Kenya. I think it's a great place to have a chapter. But gender equality, the positive impact on the quality of life of women and girls that LPG has when it's introduced to a community is well known and well documented. Sustainable cities and communities. I just mentioned this issue of air quality in urban areas. That's something that where our industry has a huge role to play. In industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Again, part of what grows an industry is having good infrastructure. We heard from James earlier about import flows and export flows. A lot of that really necessitates good infrastructure in order to take cargoes, to grow an industry, to make sure that by the time product gets to market, it hasn't, the cost hasn't increased exponentially, so that it's available to people even with modest means. Good health is an obvious one. The impacts, the positive impacts of switching from biomass or fuels like kerosene to switching to LPG are very well known. The climate discussion, which I mentioned, SDG 13, LPG displaces black carbon, which causes climate change. It's not a greenhouse gas. And propane and butane, the 2 gases which make up LPG, are not listed as greenhouse gases. There are 9 greenhouse gases listed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Propane and butane are not on that list, whereas methane is. And then decent work and economic growth. We heard in an event we did recently from a colleague in Bangladesh who said for every cylinder of LPG sold in Bangladesh, there were, I think he said, 15 different industries that were impacted by the sale of that cylinder. So from the transport to the filling, to the cleaning of the cylinders, to the distribution of the fuel. It was a really interesting observation into how embedded our industry is in providing work and jobs in the communities where it's available. Next slide, please. So the other other SDGs were maybe, it's not as obvious how the LPG industry contributes to achieving those goals, but where we still feel there is an obvious contribution are listed here. No poverty, zero hunger, quality education. I think it was just mentioned earlier by Wanjuku about allowing children who would otherwise be searching for firewood or working to have time to spend time on studies. Clean water and sanitation, reduction of inequalities, responsible consumption and production, life below water. LPG is increasingly being used as a maritime fuel, whether on big ships, the VLGCs, which we all talk about, that are moving gas across the ocean, or in smaller vessels like shipping fleets or ferries. The quality of life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and then finally the 17th goal, which is partnerships for the goals, and that's where WLPGA comes in, trying to work with these different intergovernmental organizations. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do at the WLPGA is link objectives and distinguish the ones between that have direct influence and where LPG has less direct influence. And you can see in the infographic, which is here, and it's at the first slide of my presentation. The 5 slide, or the 6 goals around SDG 7 are the ones where we have a direct influence, and the ones further out are where we have an indirect influence. So we're creating a database of case studies from around the world that are being provided by our members that analyze how LPG is contributing to these various different goals. Next slide, please. And part of what we're trying to do is not only educate our members about what the SDGs are, about how they should be thinking, about communicating, because they'll become increasingly important in their markets to demonstrate that LPG is contributing to achieving the SDGs, but also promoting the role of LPG in achieving the SDGs to outside stakeholders. And you have to the left a document which was completed in 2019, which is the first document the WLPGA has ever created, focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the next, you have a webpage on our website, which I encourage you to visit, and where we are starting to add a new page, or new element to this, where we'll be putting impact stories. So they're kind of like mini case studies from our membership of different initiatives, different projects that they have around the world that are contributing to achieving 1 or 2 or 3 of the SDGs. And that's the project that we'll keep doing, to kind of create a database of projects that people can look at to understand how LPG contributes to achieving these various different SDGs. Next slide, please. This is a quote from the former Special Representative of the Secretary General of the UN for an organization called Sustainable Energy for All, which is now being led by an African woman, a Nigerian woman. Rachel Kites, she spoke at an event that we held in 2017. And I'll draw your attention, I'll encourage you to read the whole quote, but I would draw your attention to the final slide, the final sentence, where she says, we would be advancing progress on the SDGs on health, poverty, women, children, environment, deforestation, energy, and climate. So that's quite a list. Those are the obvious ones where the LPG industry has an impact. I would argue that most of these goals, most of these objectives, most of this progress would be felt more keenly in developing countries, such as in East Africa. And I think that's something to bear in mind in the context of today's discussions. Next slide, please. So why LPG? I think I'm going to go through this relatively quick, this section. I do think it's important to highlight this, although I know that we've heard a bit about this peppered throughout the day. But it is important to recognize the qualities that make LPG such a good solution, particularly in a development context, and the portability, the storability, the cleanliness. I'm from Atlanta, which is the home of Coca-Cola, so I always say that you can take LPG to anywhere you can take Coca-Cola, and basically you can go anywhere on the planet and get Coca-Cola. So anywhere on the planet you go, you can get LPG to get there. Next slide, please. And growing demand. So if you're growing demand to try, whether it's a cooking market or whether it's using other applications, what are the issues that work best? What are the things that are absolutely necessary in order for demand to grow? I think clear government policy, there's been a good discussion about that today. That's absolutely key. There has to be government incentives. Government has to buy in to the industry growing. And I know the Kenyan government, at times it buys in more than others, but there has been a clear policy. It's been pushed by the PIEA and the good work that they do. And the industry does seem to be growing quite a bit. There has to be a tangible benefit to end users, and we're very confident that that is the case. Anytime you introduce LPG into a community, the quality of life of people in those communities, especially women, girls in that community, it improves exponentially. And there has to be strong and effective industry implementation. This is where we come in. This is the challenge to the industry. David was speaking before about safety. And our industry has to be self-regulating. It has to interact with government, to communicate effectively with government through organizations like the PIEA, so that the government understands what the industry needs to operate effectively, safely. But the industry has to police itself and ensure that it's providing safe and effective service. And that's extremely important. And then the last point is difficult to control: population growth and increased income. But we have seen over the last 10 or 15 years, many countries that for the first time in their history had economic growth and social stability, and started to see growth in the quality of life of large numbers of people in those economies. And when their quality of life started to grow, one of the first things they wanted to do was stop cooking on biomass and move to a cleaner form of cooking, and LPG provides a solution for that aspiration. Next slide, please. Just to underscore the critical role of government, if any government officials are joining us, we did an analysis a few years back and created these guidelines for the development of LPG markets. And in speaking to our members around the world, it became very clear to us that having appropriate laws and regulations that are enforced, it's one thing to have the laws, it's another thing to have them enforced, are the single most critical factor in whether you will eventually be able to create a grassroots LPG industry that will be able to grow in the long term. So that's something I always try to underscore in my presentations. The government has to be involved. The industry has to be able to speak through the government, through a credible institution or organization or individual, and the government has to buy into the growth of the market. Next slide, please. And then there's obviously some challenges, and this is whether you're talking in the context of the SDGs or growing a cooking market. There's the issue of fear. There's a lack of consumer awareness. People are often afraid to put a cylinder into their homes. They don't understand it. A lack of laws, a lack of regulations, a lack of enforcement. Most often it's a lack of enforcement that we see. The incomes being too low for the cost barrier, although I have to say East Africa has been a pioneer in overcoming this challenge, which has been a challenge that has existed forever since the industry started. And by using the pay-as-you-go method, which has been pioneered in East Africa, leveraging the M-Pesa to tax credit money, really started a revolution, I think, for our industry in how we approach this pay-as-you-go opportunity. And I think that's probably going to have resonate well beyond East Africa, and we'll start seeing pay-as-you-go systems all around the world. And then finally, a lack of infrastructure. If you can't get product or store product into the country, then there's a chance it won't grow. If you don't have a product, you can't grow the market, you can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. So I'll wrap up here. I'll invite you all to Dubai at the end of this year, the week of December 5th through December 9th. It is LPG week. We're hoping that it can be in person. I'm hoping to see all of you there. It'll be an excellent opportunity for us to continue these discussions. We do hope to have at least a partial focus on the African markets in Dubai. And we hope that you'll all be able to join us. So with that, I'll wrap up. And David, I'm not sure if you're going to manage the Q&A, if there is one, or...
There's no questions come through, Michael, apart from somebody who was struggling to actually see or hear you, but I think it was a problem on his side. You came over pretty clear for me, so that was all good. Yeah, I mean, all the presentations that everybody's seeing today, they'll be made available after this summit. So all good, Mike. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, and congratulations, guys. This is a great platform. It's working really well, and I look forward to doing this next year live and in person.
You're on. Okay, well, for the rest of you, if you'd like to leave session 8 and join the 9th webinar session, which is a roundtable, and in particular, I'd like to ask my panel now to, in particular, join the roundtable, and we can go backstage.